All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. It's mid-afternoon. I know people have for this time of the session. First couple of weeks, this is late. Here in a couple of weeks, it'll be early, but 3 o'clock is right now. Pretty late in the afternoon. People have a lot to do, so I want to go ahead and call the meeting to order. And Representative Cantrell, I want to ask you again if you would lead us on the vote.
Okay, let's pray together. Father, we're grateful for the opportunity to be together this afternoon, and Lord, again, we come to you asking you for wisdom, recognizing our human weakness, that we depend on you to help us make good decisions, things that will help the people of Georgia. And I pray for our presenters today, give them clarity as they speak to us, help us to understand the important issues that are before us. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
All right, I mentioned last week wanted to have this meeting about security of the electric grid. We've had a hearing, I think, session before last, a year before last, something like that, and but I think all of us have probably been to conferences and been more involved in some of these issues, and probably learned at least some things about the issue. I didn't know this last week when I called this hearing, but it just so happens that tomorrow the NERC, North American Electric Reliability Corporation, is going to be in a hearing at Congress. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
On this very same issue. So it's not just us that are it's not just we that are concerned about it, but at all levels of government. And before we get started, I'll just say that back about a month and a half ago, something like that, Georgia Power and the EMCs invited me to a meeting out in Tucker where they talked about this issue and did some demonstrations and tried to explain. I wasn't the only one there, but tried to explain the issue more than what we had learned anyway at that point. And I think the main thing out of that meeting that was the air, I think what they call it, the air gap between the operational systems that is used for the grid and the corporate or the operational system that's used, that's actually connected to the internet, that we all can get on, which is very very interesting, and glad that I found out about that, and they probably will talk about that some here in a few minutes. But what I have, I don't want to say learned, but I've done a lot of reading, and apparently, from what I understand, that air gap is not always secure. I have read about the United States and Israeli attack on the computer systems in Iran about 3 years ago, something like that, and the air gap was definitely bridged there. And then when the Iranians came back and were afraid, I think, to attack the United States computer systems, but they attacked Saudi Arabia, the same thing there. There was no direct connection to the systems, and it's my understanding also that the computer systems that the Iranians use is made by Siemens, and it's very similar to what's used on the different companies involved in the grid here in the United States. So, having said that, I want to introduce the presenters, and then I hope that whoever the presenters are, that you'll be available for questions.
Yes. We do have a public comment sheet in front of Representative Jackson.
And we do have a public comment sheet over here in front of Representative Jackson if you have anything that you would like to present to us. It really is. It's a tremendously important issue. And I'm not trying to put and this is not to put anybody on the spot. It purely is for us to try to learn. So when our constituents ask us about it, we can, and some of you may know more about it than I do, certainly, but we can more intelligently answer their questions and try to explain to them, because what we don't want is people to go around in a panic mode thinking that the whole world's going to come down upon them because of something that might happen tomorrow, or that the likelihood is there that something might happen tomorrow. So that's what this is about. It's really to learn. It is not to not to point any fingers or say anybody's doing anything wrong, because we don't have enough information, even if we wanted to do that, to do that. So anyway, with that, I think Jamie how you pronounce it? Hawken? You're going to introduce somebody, I think, who's going to speak. Okay. Bill, you're in the witness chair.
Thanks for playing.
I would love to stay, but I have so much to drive.
You go ahead.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee members. My name is Jamie Hawken. I'm the Director of Legislative Affairs for Georgia Power Company. And first off, just want to say thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today about grid and cybersecurity. As we've done in the past, we're going to tag team this with our partners, the EMCs. And so Bill Adams with Georgia Power is going to go up first, and he's going to talk about grid security, kind of the physical side of security. And then Jason will introduce a gentleman from GSOC. He's going to talk to you about cybersecurity. And if I may, just give you a little bit of background on Bill Adams. Bill is a 30-year veteran of Georgia Power and Southern Company. He spent 30 years in our transmission organization doing design, planning, construction. So Bill truly understands our business as it pertains to the kind of the physical and the transmission side of what we're doing. He's also, over the last 4 years, kind of spearheaded the physical security of our transmission assets. So he truly is kind of at the forefront of what we're doing as far as grid security goes. And if I may, before I turn it over to Bill, I did want to point out we also have a gentleman in the audience today, Mr. Curley Henry. Curley, if you don't mind just raising your hand. Curley is the Director of Cybersecurity for Southern Company. And so as we get to the Q&A part of the discussion, just want to make sure, pointed out, we have another resource here for any questions that we may have. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Bill Adams.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you, Chairman Parsons. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today about physical security, and to be honest with you, I think my biggest challenge is going to be doing this in about 10 minutes, because I could easily talk for several hours and not fully cover the topic. So I'll hit it at a high level. I'll hit it pretty quickly and give you an opportunity to ask me questions when we wrap up. You want to go to the next slide? So before I get started, just a brief overview about the Integrated Transmission System, or the ITS, in Georgia. It is a jointly owned system. We own individual facilities, but Georgia Power, Georgia Transmission Corporation, MEAG Power, and Dalton Utilities are the owners. We work very closely together. We share best practices, we share operating procedures, and we share operating one operator operates the entire system for us. We do joint planning on the system. So we work closely together. So while we may have some small differences in specific programs, what you'll hear today about physical security and cybersecurity applies to the entire ITS. Next slide. So for most of the industry, things changed on physical security April 16th, 2013. Prior to that date, our main security concern was preventing copper theft or vandalism. On that date, in just south of San Jose, California, Pacific Gas and Electric substation called Metcalf was attacked by several individuals armed with assault rifles, and they fired over 100 shots into the substation. They damaged 17 to 19 pieces of equipment, depending on which report you read, did over $15 million worth of damage in that attack. Now, it's important to note that there was no loss of load as a result of that. Now, they were fortunate. The attack happened at night. The loads weren't that high, so their system operator was able to take action to prevent any loss of load. So after that event, the industry came together in a way that I've never really seen in my career, as far as open sharing and communicating, to share information on threats, to share information on best practices. As a matter of fact, the day after the event, there was a conference call hosted by the North American Transmission Forum with over 50 utilities involved. People on the ground at Metcalf, the PG&E employees, talked with us very openly and candidly about what happened and shared information, because at the time we didn't know if it was a terrorist attack, part of a coordinated attack across the country. if it was just disgruntled employee or disgruntled customer. And as a matter of fact, they still don't know because they've never solved the crime to this day. But we worked closely over the next 6 months around the industry. There were numerous industry working groups that got put together to share information. We coordinated closely with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation that Chairman Parsons mentioned a while ago, and we were engaging with them to let them know the efforts that were going on around the country and around the industry. Late 2013, early 2014, the Wall Street Journal published a series of articles that you may remember. Prior to that, all of this physical security stuff had kind of flown under the radar. We were getting a lot of stuff done, but it hadn't gone public. They published the articles based on the Metcalf Attack that focused on grid vulnerabilities, and as you can imagine, that generated a lot of discussion, particularly in Washington. So shortly after that, Congress sent a letter to the acting chair of FERC at the time and directed her to create a grid security standard. 3 months later, FERC directed NERC, who is responsible for creating those standards, FERC approves them. 3 months later, we had an approved physical security standard, which is really unprecedented. The normal time for creating and approving a standard is 2 to 3 years. So really fast moving to create that standard. And it's called CIP 014. That's Critical Infrastructure Protection 014. The standard has several requirements. Number one, it requires all transmission owners to study their system to identify a critical facility. And that's defined as those facilities that if you were to lose the entire facility, then it would have a negative impact on the interconnection as a whole. You may have local load loss, but if it impacts the national interconnection, then you identify that. Second, you had to do a vulnerability assessment on those facilities and then create a security plan so that you could address those vulnerabilities. And then you had to have your studies, the vulnerability assessment plan, verified by an independent third-party security expert. And you can see on the picture, just a quick highlight, the top right picture is actually Metcalf substation today. It didn't have that wall 4 years ago during the attack. It just had a normal chain link fence, so they've done a lot of work there. Next slide, please. So in the ITS, we really took a two-pronged approach to this topic. Of course, first prong is some physical security around our facilities. I'll talk about that in a second. But more importantly, a focus on grid resiliency. Resilient grid has the ability to withstand adverse conditions and remain stable. Those could be storms, they could be ice storms, they could be tornadoes, hurricanes, or man-made events. So with that focus on resiliency really is a long-term approach. In the short term, you got to look at your real-time operations, make sure you have a redundancy and flexibility in real-time operations. Mutual assistance programs, we have mutual assistance programs both nationally and locally so that if we do have an event, we can call on our neighbors to help, just like we do in storms. Equipment transportation, the logistics around moving some of this large major equipment, most of it has to be carried on railroads, so that can create delays. In the intermediate term, we're looking at spare inventory optimization. Typically, from a sparing standpoint, we base our spare inventory on historical failure rates. So when you think about a catastrophic event like a terrorist attack, it makes you think about sparing differently. So you may need additional spares than you normally do just for typical failures. Of course, physical security, cybersecurity, participating in drills and exercises both at a national level and at a local level. In the long term, focusing on transmission planning. So typically if you need to expand your system, what you may do is look at increasing the equipment in an already existing facility. So what you're doing is you're making that facility more critical. It makes your system more vulnerable to an attack. So maybe it's better to, instead of adding to an existing substation, build a new substation, separate those. You have two different facilities, neither one of them are as critical, so you don't really have all your eggs in one basket. Focusing on standardized plans and design so you can easily swap equipment from one location to another. working with our suppliers on R&D. The transformer industry in particular is doing a tremendous amount of research around making transformers less vulnerable and also making them lighter so that they're easy to transport. Next slide, please. So that's the resiliency side of it. The other piece of it is actual physical protection. So when we started looking at physical protection strategy, really 4 different tasks that we had to do. First, assess the system. We completed over 60 vulnerability assessment at critical substations, our control centers, and where we store our spare equipment, because they're vulnerable to attack. If somebody destroys your spare equipment, then that leaves you less resilient. On the testing side, you know, a tremendous number of companies have come out of the woodwork trying to get their piece of the pie. Right, so we're trying to evaluate those products and see what's best for our system, looking at ballistic protection, looking at different radar intrusion. The intrusion detection business has really gotten high-tech. There are a number of options for that. Ballistic impact sensors, we're working with an R&D company to develop a low-cost ballistic impact sensor that we can attach to transformers, and if it senses a ballistic impact, it'll send a signal to our control center so that we know that a facility's been attacked and we can take operator action. And then developing what we're calling our security suite of options. So once we identify the products that we want to use, we use those consistently and in a standard method across all of our facilities. So we've got one supplier for that. Developing a design basis threat so we know what threat we're trying to protect against, and then finally developing those site hardening plans for each site. So we've basically gone through those 3 steps, and we're in the implementation phase now, where we're purchasing that additional spare equipment so we can deal with a catastrophic event, installing those security enhancements so that we know that we are compliance with the CIP 14 standard. Next slide. So just gives you a quick overview of the number of stations we're talking about. The colors are a little off. That top one is supposed to be red. This is what we call our security triangle, but at the top of the triangle are those sites that will get what we call max security. So those are the sites that have to be in compliance with that physical security standard CIP 14. There are very few of those facilities in Georgia. The redundancy that we have built into our system makes us much less vulnerable. So there are very few facilities there, but they'll get the full intrusion detection, secure perimeter, enhanced lighting, a number of things that we will do in those stations to give them max security. But we won't stop with just complying with the standard. The next step down below that is probably 40 to 50 less critical stations, but still important. And those may be things that stations that, for example, provide off-site power to our nuclear plants. They're also in scope for another cyber standard called CIP 006, and that cyber standard is really the physical protection of critical cyber assets. It's a much broader standard, so it covers a bigger scope of facilities than the physical security standard. So those stations will get a lower level of security based on the vulnerabilities that we identified in those vulnerability assessments. And then the remainder of what we call our transmission substations, and those are the higher voltage substations in the state, will just get our standard normal protection that we do for all of our facilities. So that wraps up my prepared remarks. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you, and I'll be glad to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Members of the committee, any questions? I don't see any. I wanted to ask if I could, and the day that back in November, whenever it was, that I was at, I think there was 2 or 3 of us legislators out there, and we went to a substation and we saw some of I think there was a physical barrier that had been put on one side, and I think there was also the radar. I think the radar was being deployed there too somehow, or they were going to. I remember talking about the radar and showing us a particular place there on that substation out around Tucker.
That's correct. Those are some of the pilot facilities that we put in to test those products. We've completed that evaluation, and now we're implementing those across the state in our more critical facilities.
Well, that incident I think that you mentioned, I think it was in California, where the I think it was in California, the one
That's
where
correct.
that one, from what I've read anyway, out there, they were able to, by, I don't know how you do it, but rerouting and everything, it turned out not to be a major outage, or maybe there was for that one area, I don't remember. But anyway, it was taken. At least my question though, with these substations, as far as physical security, would there have to be a coordinated attack on a number of them before it would result in something of say the size of a city of Atlanta been out for a number of days? Or I mean, would one take a city out, or would it take a coordinated attack on maybe a dozen or something like that?
It would definitely take a coordinated attack. There's a tremendous amount of resiliency and redundancy built into our system, so it's an interconnected system on the transmission level.
Okay.
So if you take any one element out or any hub out, then the operators have the ability to reroute using the rest of the interconnected grid. So it would take a coordinated effort at more than one facility to cause an extended outage. Now, there may be some local load out that, again, the operators can take action and respond to that.
Any questions? Yeah, we do have a question. Yeah. What?
You had an EMP explosion in one of these places. Would that take that out for a long time, or could you?
Yeah, if you speak into the mic, these things are webcast, and if you don't speak,
yeah, if you had an EMP attack, what would the significance be? Would you have to have several EMPs to take out the entire city, or would one do it?
So EMP is a little bit different animal. There's really two versions of a potential attack. So one would be what's called a high altitude electromagnetic attack, which is basically a nuclear bomb exploded at a high altitude that would cause widespread problems. And then you have IEMI, which is intentional electromagnetic interference. And those are smaller devices that may be mounted inside a van that you can pull up next to a facility, and potentially, we really don't know the impact to that. There's a lot of uncertainty around EMP and the impacts to the grid. We are participating in a research study by the Electric Power Research Institute, where they're working to first identify what the impacts would be for both IEMI and a high altitude explosion, and then how effective certain protections can be. So with a high altitude, it could significantly impact a wide area across a significant portion of the United States. For the local device, it'd be like attacking one station. You'd have to take out numerous stations, and we're not sure at this point in time if they could really do significant damage with those devices.
Well, thank you. I know I want to talk about warfare, but I know the military, they think the next war will start with a huge cyber attack. That's just what we're going to start with. And then because all of our devices are so integrated with technology that you can almost have a hard time with the modern military jet of fighting without your technology on board.
Mm-hmm. I'm not the cyber expert. I'm going to let David address that question.
I see. I think Representative Dickerson had a question first. Oh, okay.
There you go. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is twofold. It's around the third slide regarding the physical security SIP. Typically, it's my experience that when you look at the SIP, it doesn't include two things. One, it doesn't assess the interoperability. In other words, it doesn't look at the vulnerability when you're trying to connect a 21st century system to a legacy system. And so it would be great if you can share with us if that kind of assessment has been done where the systems are talking clearly with one another. And then the second is around training, having those operators capable to make sure that the immediate response to a physical security, that they're one qualified and properly trained to be able to respond in a quick manner.
Yeah, I'll address the second question first because I have a lot more experience in a control center environment with the operators. There is a significant training requirement for our operators and procedures in place for them to identify first and then respond to some type of attack on the system. We drill that. We have black start drills where the system goes down, trying to restart the system from basically everything out. The operators are required to have a certain number of continuing education units each year in order to maintain their certification as an operator. So I feel very confident in the training of the operators to respond to an event. It's very similar to responding to tornadoes or to hurricanes. And we have a lot of experience with those type of events. In either one of them, whether it's a man-made attack or whether it's a natural event, you've still got load out, you got facilities damage that you have to respond to. I'm a little unsure on your first question about legacy systems versus new system. Is that from a cyber standpoint?
No, not necessarily from physical. Okay. So, for example, if your grid can only take, and I'm just being very broad here, but if your grid is capable of monitoring micro areas, neighborhoods, and they're more equipped with digital meters, that substation may not be able to talk with that latest and greatest technology because you have to go back and update that substation with technology so that way it can go back to control centers or you can quickly communicate because it's no different than if I use my old cell phone, which was a flip phone. I won't be able to transfer emails, right? Yeah. And so there are some legacy systems in Georgia, probably in our rural areas, that may not be up to par as it may be in downtown Atlanta.
Well, I can't.
And so it's the interoperability challenge from a physical standpoint than anything else.
I don't believe. I know for the Georgia Power System. So the SCADA system that we use to operate our facilities, they all use the same technology. So there's no older technology in those stations. As we upgrade systems, we upgrade the entire system, and we don't necessarily change the technology between facilities. So we do have that ability to communicate. Now, there may be some other systems. For example, we communicate with GTC's devices as well. And I'm not technical enough to explain that to you. I'm not going to put David on the spot, but we can, if you want me to follow up, I'll be glad to follow up and try to get that information.
Okay.
For you.
That'd be great.
That'd be great.
Yeah, appreciate it. And I think Chairman Martin had a question, and this will be a good time with Chairman Martin coming up, and after having the last one with two questions, we're going to need to limit to one question. Maybe a timely time. And because really, the questions are great. Really appreciate it, but we do need to move on to, not right this second. I want you to ask your question, but we do need to move on to the cyber part of it.
I was just wondering if we were going to have dinner later. No, I'm just kidding. Wouldn't want to stand in the way of everybody's dinner, Mr. Chairman. No, seriously speaking, what the gentleman talked about an EMP, in reality, should there be, is it not true, if there were the high-level EMP, certainly that's a grid issue, but isn't it true that would damage the infrastructure such that all these things would be on and be damaged probably in such a way that, I hesitate to say this, the grid might be the least of our worries, because the actual equipment that we need the electricity to run, if it is on when that EMP, if it's large enough to knock the grid off, it would fry MRI machines, it would fry respirators in hospitals, it would fry all of that electronic equipment too. In theory, I guess we're fortunate that we've never done that. So your focus is on really is it not on the physical aspects on the ground in critical junctions, and also the cyber gap. I think the chairman made a great point about the air gap between what touches the world and what touches the grid. Is that where your focus is? Is that a fair? estimation?
Our focus today is more on the physical security and the resiliency of the grid. On the EMP topic, we are engaged in the research. At this time, we don't feel like there's enough solid scientific evidence out there to tell us what we need to do to harden the grid. We're not sure at this time exactly from a real scientific standpoint what the impact will be. Yeah, the general thought is that there'll be a significant impact. We're all very dependent on electronic devices, so my understanding is those will be impacted significantly if you have that type of event, but we just don't know for sure right now about the science.
Thank you.
I don't see any other questions. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Good questions from the members too. Appreciate that. David, Jason, you're going to introduce somebody. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Jason Bragg, Vice President of Government Relations for Georgia EMC. Georgia EMC represents all 41 of our state's electric membership corporations, including also Oglethorpe Power Corporation, Georgia Transmission Corporation, and Georgia Systems Operations Corporation. Today I want to introduce to you David Revel, who is our Vice President of Power Technology for Georgia Systems Operations, GSOC as we call them. GSOC is our leader, is the systems operations company for all the EMCs along with Oglethorpe and Georgia Transmission. They handle cybersecurity for us, and I'm going to turn it over to him to give his presentation, and he is the cyber expert for us. So thank you.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with the committee today on the cybersecurity of the electric grid. Certainly concur with the chairman's earlier remarks that this is an important issue and one that we take very seriously in Georgia. First off, I'd like to start out by highlighting some of the incidents that you may have heard about recently in the news, and then I'll speak to some of our ongoing efforts to address cybersecurity. Maybe a couple more. One more. Thank you. So on December 23rd, 2015, the first confirmed electrical outages due to a cyber attack occurred nearly simultaneously at 3 Ukrainian power companies, which they refer to as Oblenergos. The attack actually began approximately 6 to 9 months earlier than that, when employees at the power company received a phishing email that had a malicious Microsoft Office document attached, similar to what you see in the bottom right of the slide here. Once opened, the malicious code that was inside that document allowed the attackers to steal the usernames and passwords of the company employees, which could then be used to gain remote access to their system. It's important to note that their systems are not architected like we do here in the U.S., and they do not have the standards over there that we leverage, even though they are using similar machines and vendors as we do in the United States. The remote access was then used to operate circuit breakers, which caused approximately 225,000 customers to lose power. And even though this was a first of its kind event, customers were only out for about 6 hours as crews were dispatched to manually restore power. Now, nearly a year later, on December 17th, just over a month ago, the Ukrainian grid was again hit by a cyber attack, this time taking out the Pivnichna substation, causing customers in parts of Kiev to lose power for about an hour. At the current time, much less is known about this attack from last month, but we're still monitoring our sources and looking for additional information. Next slide. Now, another event that you may have heard about relates to the Grizzly STEP report that was released jointly by the Department of Homeland Security and FBI on December 29th of last year. This report was intended to contain indicators of malicious Russian cyber activity and was released shortly after President Obama's executive order placing sanctions on Russia. The handling of this event was truly an excellent example of the electricity sector coordinating with the federal government and broadly communicating information regarding the need for an elevated security posture. Prior to the release of this report, the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council, or ESCC, which is a group of electricity utility CEOs, who represent the sector to government, held a conference call with their government counterparts obtaining information about the Grizzly Step report. The ESCC then coordinated with trade associations who ensured that the message was communicated to the entire industry. NRECA, the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, shared the information with cooperatives like us across the country. The Edison Electric Institute shared with investor-owned utilities, and the American Public Power Association shared the information with municipal utilities. The Electricity Information Sharing and Analysis Center also prepared some additional information on Grizzly Step specific to the electric sector and made it available on their secure portal. This allowed utilities such as ourselves to become aware of the report, monitor for the specific threat indicators, and validate that all of our systems did not have these indicators on them, all within just a few hours of the report's release. Although the information in the report contained important data, many of the indicators referenced required confirmation of their value. In addition to malicious indicators, this report also included some indicators of legitimate communications as well. As utilities were sharing information about what they found, unfortunately some of that information was leaked to the press. This led the Washington Post to write a story on December 30th with incorrectly asserted that Russian hackers had penetrated the U.S. electric grid. Ultimately, it was determined that a user at Burlington Electric in Vermont triggered one of the indicators when they were checking their Yahoo Mail account on a company laptop, which had nothing to do with grid operations. So, next slide. Now, should something malicious ever be discovered on the U.S. electric grid, one of the most important things that we can do to prepare is exercise. We exercise our incident response processes on a regular basis internally, but we also do coordinated exercises as well. Once every 2 years, we participate in an electricity sector-wide grid security exercise called GridX that's run by the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. During the last GridX in 2015, over 4,400 individuals participated across 364 organizations. This gives us a chance to exercise our coordinated response in Georgia in the ITS, working with Georgia Power, MEAG, and our local FBI office, among others. Next slide. We also make significant investments to prevent cyber attack. In fact, the electric sector is one of the only critical infrastructure sectors that has a robust, mandatory cyber and physical security standards. Bill Adams recently told you about some of the physical security standards that we implement. We are audited regularly by our regulators, and any failure to comply with these standards can result in sanctions of up to $1 million per day per incident. We are also constantly working to improve security standards in our sector. I am the co-chair of an industry committee that is working with the North American Electric Reliability Corporation and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to update the standards to increase the security posture of the grid. In addition, we work with a number of groups, including the North American Transmission Forum, to share security best practices above and beyond what is required by the standards, promoting a culture of continuous improvement. Next slide. Overall, all of this effort has resulted in excellent performance by the North American bulk electric system. Since 2014, when these metrics were first developed, there have been no cyber incidents resulting in a loss of load and no incidents at all in the past 2 years. There has also been only one physical incident on the bulk system that resulted in a loss of load. This performance is a result of the significant focus that we place on security on an everyday basis. And again, I'd like to thank the committee for this opportunity and be happy to take any questions at this time.
I wanted to ask, I don't see any questions right now, there probably will be, but look at your chart up there. 2014, it shows three cyber events. In 2015, 2016, 0. What kind of cyber event were there, those three?
I don't know specifics behind all of the numbers on the chart. I know in the past there have been some instances of what we in the industry refer to as commodity malware that had made it on machines at utility companies. So that it's possible that something like that could have been the case.
Yeah. Well, that kind of brings up the question that I have about this air gap. If there's one incident of somebody actually accessing the operations part of the grid, then it can be accessed then without going through the internet. I mean, it's got to be, if there's even one time somebody accesses the operational part of it at some point, that means it can be accessed. And not only that, it's my understanding that, there could be, I mean, you could have, theoretically, there could be many successful attacks on it that you wouldn't even know for months after it's happened. Isn't that true?
It's possible that there could have been other methods to access those systems, particularly back in 2014. Since that time, we've developed a number of new standards that came into effect last year that shore up some of the opportunities to cross the air gap, as you referred to it. Some of those included, and I think you referred to the Stuxnet incident in Iran earlier. My understanding of that incident was that a contractor had brought the malicious code over on a thumb drive. We've also updated the security standards on a national mandatory level that require protections for use of thumb drives and validating those before they're used. So, it's an opportunity where there's always opportunities for improvement, and as we learn of new techniques and things, we're constantly updating our practices to address those.
Yeah, I know that here again, when I was out in Tucker, I left there with a really good feeling that, it was almost impossible to attack the operational side because of the separation between that and, it was all private networks and everything.
Right.
But here again, from what I have read, though, the actual operational computer systems, I don't know what, there's a name for them, I don't have it right here in front of me, but that throughout the industry, as far as operating the grid, where the different companies are, as far as they're concerned, that they use a Siemens. Here, this is, maybe it's not true, but this is what I've read, that there's a Siemens computer system, basically, it's pretty much the same as a standard. That actually, here again, was the same, I think the same ones that the Iranians were using at that nuclear power plant that they were trying to get off the ground at that time. And that's actually access. Once, if you can access that, you can also, that is a point. In other words, that's a point that you can access and attack the electric grid. I guess what I'm saying is I left there with a really good feeling. Well, I don't think that it seems almost impossible. But then after you see these things, and that thing in Vermont that you were talking about, that was an example of fake news. But I got tied in. I got tripped up in it myself because I saw that on the either the Washington Post or the New York Times. I think they both reported that, and then I found out later that it wasn't anything near, I guess, what they reported. But I think that the possibility was there. As I recall, it did have something to do with somebody's laptop. I think you explained it a minute ago.
Yeah, and that's an example of where the laptop in question was on that separate network that we use for normal everyday business, checking our email, things like that, filling out timesheets, that sort of thing, and is a completely different system on a separate network from the other.
Well, there's another question or two, and I'm going to pretty much, I'm going to let the members ask the questions that they want to, because that's what I really wanted this for anyway. But I guess the last thing I would say is, and I'm not disputing your word, believe me. I won't say a lot more about it. If you know about it, and I really don't. What I know is what I have read and what I've been told. But when you go back and you see what people who should be, and I know just because somebody heads up Homeland Security, say somebody I know just because somebody heads that up, they're not necessarily an expert on it, necessarily. I know that when somebody is, the commanding general of CENTCOM, he is the commanding general. I've got military experience, and I know that, the commander doesn't know all the specifics. But when you have these people all through government and all through the military who will always, based on, here again, interviews that I have read, they will always, almost every one of them, I can't think of one that's ever said that they don't believe that there is a real risk with the electric grid. There's not a one of them, based on what they say, matches up to what we're being told. And I'm here again, I'm not disputing your word, but if you were to ask, any number of these people that are interviewed, it's almost certainly. I mean, they'll say it's 80, 90%. It's certainly going to happen, is what they would say, and that's not what that's not what I'm getting from you guys.
Well, and I don't mean to convey that this is an absolute, that it absolutely cannot happen. I mean, in technology, that we learn new things and we have new technology all the time, and those technologies have unique vulnerabilities associated with them, some of which we don't even know. I mean, that's some of the concept of what happened in the Stuxnet is they have a vulnerability called a 0 day, which means we've had 0 days to prepare for it because we did not know it existed prior to that. So, I mean, I don't mean to convey that it absolutely cannot happen, but I do mean to tell you that we practice a posture of defense in depth and that we have many controls in place. There's not one control that would fail that would allow something like this to happen.
Yeah.
There are many layers of defenses in place between the physical and the cyber, and training and a number of things between us and a catastrophic event like that.
Yeah. Well, here again, please understand. I mean, I'm not disputing your word. I would be in no position whatsoever to do that. I wouldn't do it anyway. But it just seems like that. When we leave this meeting, one of the reasons we had it is so that when we leave here and people ask us questions, we can have a real good feeling. And so, based on testimony, so far anyway, I would go out and tell them. Even after I was in Tucker, I had some people from another part of the state who sent some emails to me wanting us to do something, that we the state have to do something about this issue because it's imminent doom and gloom for us all. And and I told them exactly pretty much what you're telling me now, but what I've been told out in Tucker. And then they would come back, well, that's not exactly right, Chairman, because of this, that, and the other. And I just want to have a real good feeling when I tell somebody something out of this hearing that I'm telling them, I'm giving them good information. So anyway, we have a question over here. Representative Clark.
Oh, it's me.
I'm sorry.
Well, can I just clarify your metrics?
Sure.
This is Georgia's metrics, right?
No, ma'am. This is North America.
This is everybody's metrics.
That's right.
So
Unfortunately, they don't report on just Georgia.
Well, first of all, Bill works very hard, the physical security guy, as opposed to that's very understandable. But so, what about can you operationally define to me what it means to have a cyber incident?
Sure, and those are the terms on this set of metric come from our mandatory standards, and reporting is a part of that mandatory framework. So the term around cybersecurity incidents has to do with a successful unauthorized access onto the systems, either by a user or by malicious code, on the systems that actually operate the grid, are used for the real-time operations, and would exclude things on our kind of normal business network.
So they actually access the grid. Now, do you track like near misses where somebody has tried to penetrate your system?
No, that's not part of the reporting framework.
So that, to me, that's what I think you were saying, Mr. Chairman, is that these numbers look suspect. I'm not suggesting that you're not saying the truth, but I know that people work full-time at hacking, and you all have to be one of the primary targets. And if you don't track near misses or hits on your system, then how do you know that your system is really demonstrating integrity like you want it to?
And I'm not sorry. I do not mean to say that we as a company do not track near misses. I mean at the national level,
Okay.
The standards which we are required to report to NERC and others, what happens, we do not report near misses on that. For our own systems, we certainly track that. We monitor that on a real-time basis. We also have additional support from outside services that help us in monitoring that and will notify us if they see something beyond what we're seeing.
So you've had more than 3 near misses in the last 4 years?
So, I mean, in terms of the operational networks that monitor the grid, no, we don't see near misses on that. The systems that are on the public internet, I mean, just to give you an idea, at my house, I have something set up. I have my personal, I have nothing of value there, except, my personal laptop or something like that. I will see thousands and thousands of hits on that firewall every day, just like anything that sits on the internet does. And so we certainly see that sort of thing on our corporate side. But from a cybersecurity standpoint, most of that ends up being noise to us. There's a number of things that just crawl the internet, just kind of trying to poke and prod at different things that are sitting there that doesn't end up being of real value for us to look at. But that is something that we track and monitor to make sure that things don't get through that shouldn't.
Chairman Martin, I don't know which one of these you're at.
Okay, from a technological standpoint, I want to try to get where we're at here, because I understand what Dr. Joyner and the Chairman are saying here about the connectivity. So you have this thing, and you're telling us that there's this network that runs the grid, and there's this internet thing out there that we have. And is it true for me to say your standard operating procedures at the EMCs and all the people at Georgia Power we're hearing from today, standard operating procedure says those two will never be connected? That you would never have that system directly connected to the internet with firewall or otherwise. You just wouldn't connect those. That would be your standard operating. Is that true? I think that's what we refer to as the air gap, right?
So our standard operating process is that there would never be a system on the internet that could talk indirectly to those systems.
Right. So I mean, for layman's terms, there would not be a hardwire system. There's not a wireless router. I mean, when we were out at the substation, they talked about not having wireless routers at
Right.
all had to be wired. So that would be the best practices, that those would never be wired together.
So we would have a number of controls between those two networks, but there are mechanisms that through several different security protocols, intermediate systems, firewalls, and other things.
Okay, but that's where I think I think that's where Chairman Parsons is going. Okay, and if I were trying to be that guy with a whiteboard, what I'm hearing, what I have heard from you and people in D.C., I was with Chairman Parsons at the meeting we had up there about cybersecurity. What I'm hearing here is there's always a physical barrier between this thing that controls the grid and this world out here, www, the rest of the world.com, and that those two can never connect. And then what I hear is, well, there's this thing that if you get through this gate, then it has to go through that gate, and then we check with this gate, that there is sometimes when they're connected. If that's the case, that's fine. I think that's just where we as laymen are confused about it.
Right.
And if you're telling me when that happens, then there's a lot of people looking in a real-time basis that it's not set like that all the time. That's one thing. But because what I was trying to get to, and I think what Chairman Parsons was, even if you have to go through this crazy route to get there, there's somebody out there given an infinite amount of time, infinite amount of resources that's going to try to find a way to do that. And if what you're telling me is that when that connection is physically made, you're watching it in real time, and or that connection changes, because we've all seen, the securities indoors that, okay, that's there, but it rotates out every 30 seconds and something, you've got this stuff going. And again, I'm not trying to drill you on this stuff, but for us to go back and tell our folks, if I tell them it's never connected, and then one day they get in there, then it was sometimes, once is not never. And so that's what I think Chairman Parsons is trying to get to. We believe that I believe you are putting everything that in process to make sure, because usually is not true in a cyber situation, they poke at you to find if they find the door, then they come back later and do harm. And if you're telling me that connection's there, so if they poke and they find the way in, by the time they come back, it's changed again, I have a good feeling about that. So I think what the chairman's after is, you know, if sometimes they touch, tell us that, but tell us you have things in process to fix it.
Yeah,
And I think that's what Chairman Parsons and Dr. Drenner were after, that we don't understand how to talk to the people we represent. You do. And I, a long time ago, 20 years ago, I was in software business, so I know a little bit about that. I mean, if you can get to the on-off switch, if you can walk in with a thumb drive, you can always maliciously do harm. But I believe you when you tell me that 24/7 you've got a system that's systemically monitoring that if they poke a hole in it, by the time they come back to look again, it's changed. The hole's in a different place. I believe that. So maybe that's a different day to tell us how all that works. But
sure.
I believe that's what the chairman was after.
Good question, and I appreciate that. And here again, I hope that I haven't been rude to you. I don't mean to.
No, sir.
We're just trying to. We're the government. We're here to help. Okay? So, are there any other questions? We've been in here. Our hour is just about over. And yes. Oh, where you at?
Well, I had a question, and then I actually added an email question from a constituent today. That my email started working. I don't know if I've been being hacked lately, but my question was, I'd like to know the date that the Washington Post and New York Times falsely reported something, because I know that it never really happened before, and I wanted to write that date down. And secondly, the question from the constituent was, what sort of vetting is done, buzzword of the day, for employees that are involved at the levels of security, folks that are protecting us, either in the hard security or in the cybersecurity at these facilities?
Sure. This is also a component of the mandatory security standards that we have, that all employees that have any authorized access to these systems are required to go through a minimum 7-year criminal background check, as well as receive annual training for any of that. We also have a group that is working on behalf of the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council, trying to coordinate with government to allow us to have access to more enhanced background check procedures, such as those that are completed by the FBI and others. Currently, we are, as private companies, we're not authorized to perform those style of background checks, but we are working to have that legislation changed, but we do everything we can under the current law today.
Thank you. Any other questions? I believe that you've done a great job. We appreciate you
Thank
coming
you very much.
Very good information. Did the gentleman here did you have something you wanted to? I saw you move up. I didn't know if you want.
Good afternoon, Curly Henry. Thank you, Chairman. I was going to add some additional clarity. I understand the questions. I understand why there's some confusion. It was a great question about whether or not we're watching the attempts. And so just to add, that is reporting at a national level, right? And it's big picture, the cyber incidents, attacks on the grid at the large level. From a Georgia perspective, yes, we have 24-hour monitoring capabilities where people are constantly watching whether or not something is occurring. As it was noted, much like he has at his house, our companies are constantly being probed and constantly under attack. I'm sure over the last year, in addition to the things that were put up there from a news perspective, you've seen a lot of information about phishing attacks, which have become quite common, ransomware attacks. So those are things that are regularly occurring. Our ability to both detect and ensure that those things don't occur and have a negative impact on our environment is fairly high. We are continually investing in new technologies. I don't know, 3-4 years ago, you didn't hear ransomware, right? 2016, it was the hottest thing. 2017, it will be something new. So our ability to both understand what's new and then have the ability to respond and react to that is critical. On the air gap, and I was not in Tucker, so I can't speak to specifically what was noted there. There are systems that are on the grid that are totally air gapped, zero connectivity. There are other systems, and I think where you're trying to get is there ever any interconnectivity between an IT and an OT? Yes. There are some systems that do have that interconnectivity, and in those instances, they aren't air gapped. But in those instances, there are multiple layers of protections in place to both prevent as well as detect any type of malicious activity that anyone might want to take on our environments. The other thing that I would say is that we've been talking about this as if it's simply two networks, an enterprise corporate network and a grid network. When you look at our environment, you can take a substation, a singular substation, and there's multiple networks. A nuclear plant will have multiple networks. A generating plant will have multiple networks. So, correct. So even if you have a scenario, and it gets into the resiliency that Bill Adams talked about, if you had something occur in a singular network, its ability to have a larger impact is minimal, because essentially we've think of it like the hull of a ship, right? That's both for protection on the outside, but it's also for isolation. The ability that, if you hit one part, it doesn't impact the whole. The other thing, I believe there was a question that you asked there at the end about vetting of employees. So I just add that some of those enhanced background checks, we've been able to go ahead and start pushing through. There's additional things that we're doing around drug screens, and there's things that we're doing around making sure that these are recurring. 7 years ago, you didn't have anything occur, but sometime since your employment, something has occurred that may have changed your state, that might want, put you in a position where you might want to take some type of activity. So all of the things that we're doing are not one-time checks. The drug tests are random and they occur on a consistent basis. The background checks recur on a frequent basis. We have requirements that employees report. They self-report incidents, as well as things where employees may have traveled to nations that may not be friendly to the U.S. So there's a lot of vetting that occurs, and as the gentleman noted, we are continually adding those types of protections in place for our employees and for our customers to ensure the reliability of the grid.
That's good, and that was a good question too, by the way, after I had to kind of think about it a little bit. But the what's the guy's name that went to Russia? It turns out, the vetting process by that company that had Snowden. Yeah. He'd actually lied on his application to the company and about it's either a degree or a job he'd held before, and and I'm not saying that y'all are, I'm not saying you're in the same category as that, but that particular company had a contract with the NSA, I think. And he was certainly thought, that vetting process would have kept him from getting that job. I think he only worked for him like 2 months before he went to, as I recall, and took the information. But that is I hadn't really thought about that part of it. It's a very important part of the people that you have there, because it really does come down, when you think about it, comes down to the people that work there.
Sure.
And if you have a weakness, if you have a weak link there. So, are there any other questions from members of the committee? Thank you very much. I appreciate you coming. I know everybody's wanting to get up and go, but in your packet there, I have put some printouts from a book that I've been reading, and some people would completely dismiss this book, as I did for about 4 months. When I was in Chicago at the National Conference State Legislatures meeting back in, I guess it was August, one of the meetings I went to, Ted Koppel came, the news guy. He used to be redheaded, but now he's all white-headed. But he came and gave a presentation, and he's written a book. It's called Lights Out. And right after his presentation, somebody from I think one of the EMCs across the country, or some kind of a membership organization, had come, and that gentleman, he pretty much said everything that Ted Koppel had in his book, or a lot of what he had in his book, was not true. And I didn't even pick up the book. I've had that thing since August, and I picked it up Friday, the first day we were off last week, and started reading it. And I found out from reading it, it doesn't sound as outlandish to me. I think the part of the book where he gets into some of the extreme situations that an outage would cause, like moving huge numbers of the population out to camps in the West because that's the only way that you could feed them and have water for them and for them to stay alive. I mean, and maybe that's not outlandish if there were a major outages. But anyway, I've read the book, and he has spoken to a lot of people who should know what they're talking about. People who've been the head of NSA, CENTCOM, at different levels of the federal government, different levels of security, and these are some of the people I was referring to who will say that there's almost certainly at some point there could be a major outage caused by a lack of good cybersecurity. So anyway, in your booklets, I've got some excerpts from that book that you might want to read. And I hope that I've given all the proper whatever. I've given all the quotes and properly attributed all this to Ted Koppel. I don't want to get sued by Ted Koppel by giving out information from his book, but he might want to look through there. Huh? Yeah, well, I have a whole stack of them right here, yeah. So, but it raises questions, and y'all, I appreciate y'all coming. You've given us some really good information. I think that you've gotten some pretty good questions. You've gotten really good questions, and I think the information is good. And that's all really we're trying. That's our job. I mean, that's our job as a member of a committee in the Georgia House of Representatives as we serve our constituents. That's what we have to do. We have to ask these questions and bring people in and try to find out what's going on. If there's any, here again, the grid, there's a part of the grid, and this is something we'll have to get into another day. There's part of the grid that's actually under state regulation, and there's part of it that's under federal regulation. And as far as the security part, the cybersecurity, it's my understanding that at the state level, not throwing any stones or anything at the PSC, but I don't think there's not. Basically, it's my understanding that what they know about it is what they're being told by Georgia Power, who is regulated on rates and things of that nature, to the PSC. So it seems like we don't have a lot of information. There's no real stockpile of information, no center gathering point. So this is kind of it. So here again, please, if there's anything else that we need to know, keep us informed as we go through the session. And we don't want to give out any trade secrets or anything like that. And I know that you wouldn't do that anyway. But here again, it's an important issue, and we just want to make sure that we're as on top of it as we can be. Was there anything else we talked about that I should mention?
I don't think so.
I don't think so either. And unless there's anything else, we're adjourned.